So I just introduced Ralph Waldo Emerson, and I've made the case, or begun to make the case, that Romanticism really is, in many ways, the defining fountainhead of a lot of thought in the 19th century in the American intellectual experience. And I've also given you a paradigm to work with, and you're going to hear me reference that paradigm throughout the rest of the semester. I've said that whenever you read an author, you've got to ask yourself, what does that author think about God or the notion of a supernatural? What does that author think about nature itself? What does that author think about human nature? And then what does that author think about human artifice? So these four components of the universe, every one of us, when we write something, we're really kind of giving a metaphysics of how we view the world. The Romanticist wants what? The Romanticist wants us to stop turning our attention to God or godly edicts to define how we live. Lighten up. Live. Move away from those commands. Be self-reliant, not reliant upon a God. So here you see this kind of the grand modern movement from the Middle Ages, where God is at the center of all things, to this 19th century, this democratic age where the human being will be the center of all things. The I will be the center of all things. And the Romantic celebrates this as something that is excellent. Don't be constrained by God. And to the degree that you deal with nature, recognize nature as something beautiful. Recognize nature as something wild, right? And you too can be as wild as those things within nature. And you too can be daring as those things within nature. And you never know what the result might be. So stop being constrained by a God who you think rules over the universe. If you're going to be in touch with something, be in touch with nature, and don't follow these kind of older lines of thought, whether it's common sense or Reformed theology or whatever it is. It says that human beings can't do this because they're fallen, can't do this because they're imperfect, and so on and so on. The Romantic says enough of all that. The second tradition, however, I think, building upon Romanticism, that furthers this line of thought is the tradition of pragmatism. And I would argue that pragmatism is a direct result of Emerson's impact upon the world. Emerson had an amazing set of followers living in the intellectual world of Boston in the first half of the 19th century. If you were anyone who was an aspirant intellectually, you looked to Emerson as kind of creating a brave new world for all American thinkers. So what's the connection between Emerson's Romanticism and pragmatism? Well, I think to answer that question, we have to figure out what pragmatism is. And there are a variety of different pragmatisms. There is a legal pragmatism, moral pragmatism, philosophical pragmatism. But I think the best definition that was ever given of pragmatism was by its most well-known exponent, a man named William James, in a series of lectures in 1907, 30, 40, 50 years after the time period that we're covering, says the following of pragmatism. Pragmatism is interested in ideas. Right? It's interested in whether ideas are true. And he says that truth, as any dictionary will tell you, this is page 1024 of your text, is a property of certain of our ideas. Truth means their agreement with reality, as falsity means their disagreement with reality. So for an idea to be true, it must be in agreement with reality. So how's the pragmatist look at this agreement between the idea and reality itself? They look at it in very different terms than the traditions of the past. Here James will reference, in different places he calls them intellectualists, other places he calls them rationalists in this essay, but you'll see him use those terms. And what he's saying, the group of people that he's talking about there are the Platos and the Aristotles and the Augustines of the world. Those individuals that believe that we had the power, we have because of our minds, because of our logos, to be able to look at the world and to come up with definitions as to what is true and false through our assessment of the world. So we have the ability to reflect upon the nature of God. We have the ability to reflect upon the nature of nature, the nature of man, the nature of art, and to figure out what is true or false. Why? because these things in and of themselves are true. God doesn't need us to know him to be true. Nature doesn't need us to notice it to be true. Things are in and of themselves objectively true. And morality in and of itself is objectively true. This is what the rationalist or the intellectualist concludes. The pragmatist, however, says no, not at all. There is no truth contained in things in nature itself. The only thing that we know to be true in this world is the truth that we make. And hear this famous expression by James, that something is true to the degree that it actually makes a difference in life. It actually can be measured. So truth is expedient. Truth is efficient. Truth is something that we create. So let me give you an example of creating truth. A term that you heard me use, a word or idea that you heard me use throughout this course. Equality. Jefferson argued all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator. God creates them. God is real. He creates his beings, right, with equality. Jefferson saying objectively all human beings are equal. But what James the pragmatist would say is no. Look around America at the end of the 19th century. Look at the beginning of the end of the 18th century, beginning of the 19th century, and what do you see? You see 5 million slaves. You see inequality everywhere. How can equality be true if it's not present, if it's not making a difference? So what James is going to tell us is that if you want equality, you actually have to make equality happen. You have to work toward equality, and you have to actually see it before you as something real before you can talk about it as being true. So if it's an aspiration that you want, it's something that you have to be working toward rather than drawing from behind. Now, why is this going to be important? Well, my next lecture, or set of lectures, is on progressivism. And what does the progressive want? The progressive wants to bring into this world a more progressive conception of the world. A world that is progressing and being made better because it has been made better. So here you begin to see the tie. Romanticism opens up the human mind to a creative new production. Pragmatism says that that production actually equates with truth because we make truth in this world. And then the progressive is going to be what? The progressive is going to be the individual who looks at the injustices of the world, looks at inequality, looks at wrong, and tries with the power of the state or the power of the influence of the mind to move things in the direction where they are made more equal, made more just, etc. A different train of thought than the one that Lincoln hoped would move the country forward, one that will open us up to some prospects, but also open us up to some dangers, as we'll see as we move into the 20th century.